Welcome to Season 6, Episode 40 of the Be Conscious podcast. Today, I am joined by Natasha Sharma, co author of the upcoming book, Wealth Codes Sacred Strategies for Abundance. I am so curious to have Natasha tell us about the work she is doing to make conversations about death an easy conversation and what she is doing to change the world for the better. Here we go.
Welcome to the Be Conscious podcast, the show that brings you enlightened perspectives on the frequency of money, life's many challenges, and those heavy feelings that may be holding you back from living your best life. And now your host, Dr. Susan Nicholas.
Natasha Sharma was born and raised in the UK. She now lives and joins us from Mumbai, India. Her expertise is guiding people to cure themselves of physical diseases by exploring the metaphysical connection of mind, body, and soul. Her mission in life is to have conversations about death and to use that inevitability to free people to enjoy their lives right here, right now. She believes that death needs to be an easy, day to day, dinner table conversation and vows to speak openly and extensively about death until her mission is accomplished. Natasha, welcome to the Be Conscious podcast.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Natasha, now I know a little bit about you and that you do hypnosis and that you have a history of working with, I would say, the metaphysical aspects of beingness. But I'm very curious, what was your catalyst or what was it in life that now has you on this mission to have humanity speak freely and openly about death?
So, death has been my constant companion from a very young age. I was 14 years old when I lost my grandfather, who I was the closest to. And shortly after that, my mother fell sick, and then she died when I was 16. I have had a lot of loss in my life to death, all different types of death. During the pandemic, seeing the amount of loss of life, regardless of age or things sort of the paradigm shifted for me when I realized that anyone can die at any time. It's not that I didn't realize that earlier; it just became, you know, in my face, and I had to really buckle down and deal with the thought of my own death. And then I and my husband, we started doing yoga. And interestingly enough, he would finish our yoga sessions. Our teacher would finish our yoga sessions with this mantra, and it's the Mahamrittyunjay mantra. And basically, it is I was very curious about it. I decided I wanted to learn it so I could say it myself instead of just repeat after him. And then I read the translation, and somehow there was like this click for me. It talks about you accepting your own death. It talks about when the moment comes to basically um, may my moment of death be as easy as a ripened cucumber that separates itself from its stem.
Hmm.
So I started really imbibing this, and I embraced my own mortality. I embraced the fact that, for sure I'm going to die, and let that moment come easily when it does come, which it's bound to come. And in the meantime, let me just enjoy my life. Let me enjoy this incarnation. And that this was my catalyst when I looked around and I saw how many people were unable to do this, how many of my friends' parents were dying. I lost my own father in November, and the amount of disorganization that they leave behind. um, I realized that it needs to be a conversation. We need to talk about it.
Hmm. Can you take us back, Natasha, to that 16-year-old girl who lost her mother? At that time, what were your thoughts about death? And maybe you can contrast to now that you've recently lost your father, and I offer my condolences. What has changed about your thoughts about death now that you're more mature and older?
In between my mother's loss at 16 and my father's loss now, I'm 48. Um, I spent actually 30 years of that time um, not going through the grieving process for my mother. I had only the stage of grief that is known as anger
Hmm.
and a mixture of anger and denial. Those are the only stages I allowed myself. And that's how I've lived my whole life. And then I lost my grandmother, who was my mother's mother. I lost her 4 years ago, and of course, after my mother, she was my mother, my mother figure and my guide and my best friend. And it was her death that made me actually look up and study the stages of grief, and then I consciously went through them, and as a result, I also healed from my mother's loss, what was pending. And interesting you should ask this question, because when my father died, I was able to transition through the stages of grief fairly easily. And also, I'd like to add the main thing that happened with my father's death was that I lived my last year with my father, my relationship with my father, in such a way that when he would eventually pass, I honestly didn't expect it to be now. This was unexpected, but I lived it in such a way that I would have no regrets, that the day that I lose him, how will I feel? I kept on visualizing that, and that's how I lived my relationship with him. So when I lost him, I had no regrets, nothing left unsaid, nothing left undone, and so I think that's what made my acceptance of my father's death very, very easy.
Hmm. So you said a couple of things that I want to touch on. One is the grieving process and that protracted grieving of your mother at that very tender age of 16. One of the things about grieving that I've recognized, and this is more recent for me, I didn't have very early losses of close relatives, like siblings or parents. Um, but I would guess I would say I was observant of it. The first, I would say, close or meaningful loss that I had, I was 18 years old and my paternal grandmother passed. And I and it's this is gonna sound, well, maybe like an 18-year-old or newly minted 18-year-old. It was a very selfish time for me because my grandmother passed and was buried on my birthday. So she died in February of 1990, and the time of her funeral, which was a couple of maybe a few days later, fell on my birthday. And I remember feeling like nobody remembered my birthday. And I was kind of with that for a long time, like it seemed like rotten timing because it felt like a little bit of a coming of age time, but it was completely ignored given the gravity of losing kind of the matriarch of our family. And so I kind of sat with that, maybe feeling as I got older guilty and feeling that I was very selfish at that time. But that was like my first experience. It wasn't really about the loss, it was about me. And it's interesting because when I heard you speak, I think
Hmm.
it's true for everybody. It's not as much about the transition of the loved one. It's about you, because what we say is I lost, my loss. And so we make that, I believe, Natasha, about us. In whatever stage of maturity that we are, it's about us. And if we can take this a little bit further, when you contrasted the early transition of your mom early in your lifetime, and then the more recent transition of your father, you said something that made me think about another, I think, concept that if we pay more attention to, then we can all perhaps cycle and go through grief. And it's the idea you said in that last final year of my father's life, I lived it with no regret, that there would be no regret in his passing, even though I didn't know when that would come. And the way that I think about that is making closure. I think one of the things that many of us fail to do in life is to make closure with our loved ones while they are still living. And I think part of that resistance to make closure is might be denial that we don't want to face the fact that any of us are going to transition anytime soon, right? We we don't want to deal with it. And so in not wanting to deal with that inevitability,
Mm-hmm.
we also don't deal with our stuff. Like whatever's going on with us or between us, when it's a very close relation.
Absolutely.
I want to share with you kind of an experience that I went through regarding death. And this was after I wrote my children's book, The Death of Cupcake, A Child's Experience with Loss, to help children kind of with this exactly what we're talking about as adults, making closure and making sense of it and not fearing this, being able to have the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
It was the passing of my mother, my father's actually second wife who raised me. My parents were married for 43 years, and it's the mother that I grew up with who raised me. And she passed in January of last year. And I remember being very observant about the grieving process. I was mature enough to be aware. And like you, with that final year of your father, that final year that you had with your father, the prior year and a half or so with my mom before she passed, we did a lot of healing together. Like figuratively, emotionally. I mean, we did energy sessions after energy sessions and talked and kind of healed old wounds. And I remember during her passing, I was observant of my grief because I knew that I was going to grieve it, the loss, but I didn't know how I would grieve it. And it didn't occur for me until like 10 months later. And when I think about that, I think, what was that, right? There was this immediate, like, I felt like I immediately went into tasking mode because, like many people, my mother feared death. And so she did nothing in preparation. She avoided everything. And so
Mm.
on the back end of that, all paperwork and wills and directives, all this stuff, beyond just arranging the funeral. There's so many things that had to be done. And so I was the person that was, I guess, spearheading all of the tasking, really to assist my father. And all that stuff literally took, I mean, we had our estate in probate for a while. Like all this stuff took about 9 months to clear up.
Mm-hmm.
And I think uh by the end of like when everything had settled, it was like 10 months later. And then I felt it. Like this, like a sadness, mm, like I don't know, like it was something, it was in my heart, like I just felt the heaviness of it. And I was asking, what is this? Because I was like on on it, like on it. Like do this, do that, do this, do that. And then I couldn't. Like I was
Mm-hmm.
just tired and I was very introspective and I was, I was grieving and I was like, "Oh, this is what this is." Like I don't know if that I ever really grieved anyone. And so this was the first experience with it, and I didn't know what it would look like for me.
Right.
And I think what was I think I was very fortunate having experienced a conscious awakening and now being involved in the work that I do to transform energies and heavy feelings and emotions, that I knew that I couldn't delay it any longer, that my body was telling me it was time to process, that I could process it now, that all the tasks were done. And so I just allowed it, not knowing when it would end. And for me, it lasted about 3 months. And when I say 3 months, that's 3 months where I wasn't podcasting. I wasn't doing my money consciousness show. I wasn't advertising and, showing up on social media, like taking a break. And I just was being with myself and just being with it, with the energies. And then, like 3 months later, all of a sudden it lifted. Like there was a moment where I woke up and I just felt better. And I didn't there was nothing that I did differently. It was no big news or there's no trigger for it. I just did. And I said, "Oh, I allowed myself to process this. I didn't deny it. I wasn't mad about it. I just let it, I just allowed it. I just felt into it. I just introspected into it and noticed it and allowed it. And now I feel, complete." And so I wanted, I guess, to ask you, when you said that you were able to go through the grieving process with your father, I mean, beyond the steps of the grieving process, what was the feelings? Like what feelings were you processing differently than perhaps than with your mother when you said you just felt anger and denial?
So first, I'd like to say that thank you for sharing, and I'm sorry for your loss. So what you said is that is the truth, right? That is basically what my mission is, that when one is to accept our own death, the other one is when we do lose our loved ones, that we embrace the grieving process in its entirety, right? Denial is one of the stages of grief, undoubtedly, but we need to transition through that stage and embrace the other stages. And of course, it's not a linear process. It doesn't go from one to the other necessarily. We can go back and forth over months, years. But what you did is exactly what I have also been, let's say, blessed with, after my start of my self-awareness journey, and just being at one with the concepts that I've been blessed to receive, basically. And that is, whatever we feel in life, whichever, whether it's loss, death, success, joy, love, it's basically about being with how we are feeling. That is what true alignment is for me. It's where, like what you said, those 3 months, it's to give those that respect to what those 3 months required of you. And it required for you to be with yourself, to feel those feelings of sadness. And when they lifted, they lifted, right? So that's exactly what I did. That's exactly what I did, more than with my father, but before that with my grandmother 4 years ago, right? So 4 years ago, when I lost her, um and I would want to cry, I would allow myself to cry, Susan. It was no holds barred, like a kid, sobbing. I don't care who's around me. If I have tears, I will let them out.
Mhm.
Whereas you contrast that, when my mother died, you had all of these well meaning relatives hanging around saying, "Oh, don't cry, the soul will be hurt," and whatever nonsense, right? That you're teaching a 16-year-old, right? It was a lot of confusion because the adults actually didn't. I wasn't surrounded with any adult that was aware. they were all pretty much just programmed and conditioned people. Like, so I told you, they, don't cry, don't cry, it'll be okay, or all those
Mhm.
the placation nonsense. um and then if I was a kid, and if I was sitting with my friends who'd come around to make me feel better, or come to the funeral, and we're sitting afterwards and we're laughing. I actually had a relative pass by the door and say, "Oh, very good, you guys laugh and enjoy yourselves." And I'm like, so there was a lot of confusion, there's a lot of like, um so there was that, in addition to, obviously, I was 16, which is like, anyway, the most
Mhm.
difficult
Mhm.
stage between a mother and daughter. You're anyway saying that I hate you. And
Right.
so to lose her at that time was doubly hard.
Right.
And then, of course, to grow up without a mother and have to go through all the milestones without a mother, it
Mhm.
took me years. I mean, a funny thing, I'll just tell you. I mean, it's funny and sad at the same time, but I didn't realize that I actually didn't know how to size myself. Like,
Mhm.
when I went shopping for clothes, I didn't realize that if something, till many, many, many years later, I didn't realize that if something was falling awkwardly on me, it meant the size was too big. I actually, so I used to wear these oversized clothes because I didn't realize that I needed to choose a size smaller.
Mm.
So I've worn the wrong clothes my entire life. So it's a good thing I'm not fashion conscious. But so these are things that that your mother teaches you, right?
Mm.
And I'm the eldest. I don't have an elder sister. I don't have any older cousins. I'm the eldest of the clan on both sides, actually. So I had no one else. Um, and my nan was a very typical Indian. I mean, even though lived in England, she only wore her like Indian clothes. So it's not that she
Mhm.
would take
Mhm.
me shopping and choose a size 10 or an 8, you know. So I generally grew up wearing size 12 and 14, even though I was like stick thin. So you can imagine what I'm talking about. Um, so, it's things like this, right? So when my grandmother died, I allowed myself to go through every stage, including anger. If which anger stage goes anywhere from irritation all the way to full blown tantrums, right?
Mhm.
So if I found myself on a day irritated with the people around me, I knew it's because I was going through that stage. So then that helped me, because that's what awareness is about, right? That when you are aware of something, you have choice. How do I choose to behave now? And so I kept a check on that. I honored what I could, and I let go of the things that I couldn't change at that point in time. So I still miss her, definitely, but it's not like a crippling sadness like it was with my mother. With my grandmother, I had completion. She was 88 when she died. My mother was only 43. Um, so
Mhm.
there's a lot of like, there's a lifetime of love fulfilled. And she and I didn't have a complicated relationship. She was very open minded. We used to talk about sex. I could talk about stuff with her that I couldn't talk to my own aunts about. She
Mhm.
was really, really cool. So I had a full and complete relationship with her. I was there at her deathbed. I was there for her funeral, even though I didn't even have to change my tickets. The universe just made sure I was there for everything. It was just really, really
Mhm.
strange, and it was blessed. My father, on the other hand, emotion wise, I will say, like I mentioned earlier, he and I had a very, very complicated relationship. He was a narcissist. My mother's loss hit him hard, and we had a really, really rocky love hate extremes kind of a relationship. But after I came onto the path of self-awareness and I started doing my healing, um he and I reached a point where we could have a conversation without angst, because I wasn't coming from a position of being programmed anymore or conditioned. I
Mhm.
started living in my present moment. And even though he, obviously, as a narcissist, had all the triggers and buttons, I, again, would exercise my power of choice. So slowly, slowly, with practice, I stopped being triggered
Mhm.
completely. I
Mhm.
also gave up any expectations from him, which is the biggest control, in the playbook of a narcissist, right? That's how they keep you trapped. um, so the minute that I had no expectation, real or perceived, it set me free. And so
Mm.
I had and like I said, I was having conversations with my friends whose parents are also getting older, and this is the theme that emerged, that they are going to die one day. So how are you going to feel on that day? Can you tell me? And the resounding answer across the board is guilt. So
Mm.
each person is different. What would you feel guilty about? Oh, I didn't spend enough time with them. Okay, genius, spend time with them now then, right?
Mhm, mhm,
Like,
mhm,
it's very simple. So that's what I saw. That's what I did with my father. And so the I had a full closure before I lost him. So even though it was sudden, and it was definitely not expected, he was only 70. Uh, he was 2 months shy of his 75th birthday.
mhm,
So he wasn't old or very ill, but I accepted it
mhm, mhm.
because it was complete.
Yes, and I think that that's the message, right? It's making closure while you are still living, um, recognizing that when the time comes for each of us to pass, we'll be overwhelmed with certain feelings, and if you have awareness of what those feelings are, particularly when there are unresolved grievances, then the idea, of course, in making closure is that you resolve that. Why your relation, loved one, is still living. Now, Natasha, this is going to be a very provocative question. And I'm going to qualify this question by, none of us knows this for sure, but I'm curious, what do you think happens when we die? I'm going to take a quick break. We're going to revisit that question. Stay with me.
Like what you're hearing so far? Make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button now. How would you describe your relationship with money? Did you ever imagine that your deepest feelings and beliefs about money could be preventing you from acquiring all the wealth that you desire? Click the link below in the show notes to learn more about Dr. Nicholas's highly sought after Frequency of Money program to positively transform your relationship with money. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. Now, back to the show.
So, Natasha, before the break, I raised a provocative question to you. And the question was, what happens when we die? And I think this is the crux of maybe why there's so much fear around death and why it isn't yet that dinner table conversation, is because people are afraid. I think part of it, yes, of course, is what we were speaking about kind of the guilt, the feelings, the conversations that haven't yet been had, the regrets, the guilt, sometimes shame or whatever the emotion is. But I think because death, kind of what happens next remains unknown to us, that we fear it because we fear what is unknown to us. So in your view, what do you think happens to us when we die?
So you're absolutely right. There's, I'll answer your question, but first of all, there's two things. So when we think about the loss of our loved ones, that's when the guilt and the shame and any other shadow feelings might come up. When it comes to thinking about our own death, is when the fear presents itself, right? Um, I personally have been very lucky. I consider myself to be very lucky that I have not been brought up with any um, religious beliefs per se, because my father um, was an atheist. My mother was agnostic. They belong to different religions, technically speaking, like on paper. He was Muslim, she was Sikh, which are basically polar opposites. I went to a Catholic school. I was brought up in England. I live in India. I am a Hindu now. I converted. And so from a very young age, I decided I was just spiritual, like whatever that meant. And
Mhm.
so I
Mhm.
say this because as human beings we are scared of we fear death because we don't know what's happening. Those of us who do have religious upbringing, we can turn to the Bible or the Quran, or every religious text basically talks about heaven and hell and after, life and reincarnation, depending on which faith you're reading, right? So every religion seems to provide us with the answers. My view is that I don't know, so I choose to embrace faith over fear, that, it is what it is.
Mhm.
So it is going to happen, whether I'm scared or not. It is going to happen. It's like when you're on a roller coaster
Mhm.
and you can see that dip coming. Now, what are you going to do? It's going to happen. There's nothing you can do about it, right? So let's just enjoy the
Yeah.
ride. But I will say,
Yeah, you can't bail, right?
exactly, you
Yeah.
can't, there's no option on this, and that is why I'm trying to make a noise. I mean, I am making a noise about this. That people have to open their eyes and realize that it is going to happen. So face the fear, basically. Because it ain't going to change if you don't face. And exactly what you said, what happened with you, unfortunately, with your mother's death, too many people leave their stuff unorganized, and instead of the loved ones going through the grieving process, we have to deal with the mess, with the legalities and the paperwork, and it's
Mhm.
so unfair. It can be so easily avoided, right? And I'm sure that they don't mean to do it to us, but it happens, just because that's the way it is, and that this can be avoided. um Out of all the stuff that I've read about what happens after death, um I do like your approach to it, which you've written about in your book, The Duality of Being, the last chapter where you do talk about death. And it's
Mhm.
interesting. And I mean, I hope that's what happens, right? That we shed our 3D bodies easily and go off. I mean, you know, so yeah.
You know what? Thank you for bringing that up because okay, you likely know that I had what I guess is a near death experience that I brought on to myself, you know? I tried to
Hmm.
take my own life, and I remember that turning point where I thought this is it. Like when it felt like this is it where I couldn't take a breath. And then I remember the opening of being able to breathe again and knowing that I wasn't going to die in this moment, when I'm trying to take my own life as a 36-year-old woman. And then I remember leaving out of my body at age 40 when I had my, I guess, what people would term a crisis awakening, and feeling the energetic essence of me leave my physical self and having awareness that I had a physical body, I just wasn't in it. And having out of body experiences for the past decade or so, I believe provides a glimpse of what happens next. And what I've come to understand from that is that that next experience, that next awareness is as individual as the lives that we lead here on earth. And the reason I say that is because depending on your belief systems, like you talked about expectations, um, and by not having expectations, that helps you to just be, right? Whether they're real or perceived. And so I think when we die, many of us have expectations. And a lot of those expectations can be informed by our religious upbringings.
Hmm.
And so I was I came up through the Southern Baptist Church, which I think is hilarious. But I remember being baptized when I was a child, and even then thinking, "What is this? What are we doing? How is this?" It was to save my soul, right? So when I died, I would
Uh-huh.
go to heaven, whatever that is, and that if you believe differently or not the right way of this kind of theatrical debacle, then there was hell for you, right? Like this fire and brimstone kind of
Mm.
thing. And I really think, I know this may sound like a tangent, I really don't think that the media, the entertainment media helps, because it's all about this awful experience of death. Like, it's all about killing and all the sorrow and all the stuff and leading up to it, right? It's just horrifying, right? That's how it's depicted. It's just this horrifying experience. And of course nobody wants that, right? Nobody wants that.
True.
And so
True.
I think there's a lot of distinctions to be made here. I agree with you 100% that when it comes to our own death, that's where the fear is. But I think if I really kind of go deeper into that, I think what it is, like when we get rid of the pain and the suffering and the dramatics of it, like just that, like the moment of transition, the moment that that energetic essence leaves the body and the shell remains, that's no longer animated. I think in that part of it, I think the pain and the suffering is in the holding on, like not allowing the transition to occur or trying to prevent it or fighting it. And I think the liberation or the freedom is in the letting go. And so I think if we could come to the place of the beauty of letting go, it could ease a lot of these fears of the transition. You see, nobody knows what's coming next, right? We don't know, like, that conscious sight, the one that is without our physical eyes. It's I guess the way that I could describe it, Natasha, is when I would leave out of my body, it's like I could see without my physical eyes, but it's like the sight that we have in a dream, let's say. Except it's not confusing and it feels as real as this third dimensional existence. So much that you question which is real. Is it this third dimensional existence or is it what I'm experiencing
Wow.
as energy, as consciousness? Yeah, so it's the idea of what are our concepts of reality, right?
That's really
And
amazing.
what do we accept as true? I accept both. I think,
Mm.
I've since argued that the dream state is as real as this, even though you may not understand it. But that's our way of connecting back to the oneness of all of it, is in that state. And we must go into that state every day. We must sleep, or we cannot survive in this embodiment. And so I think if we are comfortable, if we can become comfortable with the idea that this is just one of many incarnations that we've had, right? This is, when we are born into the universe, we're born into it for a very long time. And this thread of our existence is a energetic vibrational thread. It's energy. And that we don't remember our prior existence and perhaps we won't remember this one. Who knows? And so the idea is when I transition out, to me, it is a liberation. It's a liberation from this dense third dimensional space, this third dimensional body, the weight of it. the pain of it. And I just feel like it it feels so incredibly free, like so freeing, so light, so very beautiful. And so I've come to this place where I do not fear that. Like I'm excited about that letting go and experiencing what is next for my soul's evolution. The question is, how do we get the rest of humanity to that place of, even if it's just acceptance and peace? I don't know. I think one thing that we can do is create conscious media where we, instead of showing like this awful, disgusting, destructive death, painful death, um, have other ways of showing that, so people can choose for themselves what they want to believe. That's what we're going to do anyway. But that there is something, there is another alternative.
Right.
And I also think what's really important, Natasha, is that if we recognize that it is an energetic shift that we're going to make, that we'll look at the importance of raising our energy while we are still embodied. Because I don't want to transition out full of fear or regret or guilt or shame. I want to transition out, like I want my energy to be the light and of love, right? Like the highest vibration I can reach. So that when I do
Hmm.
have awareness of where I land next, it's at that higher vibrational state
Absolutely.
that I would say that I've transmuted those denser energies, almost like I graduate from Earth School. Like that's what we're here to do. So I get to graduate cosmic kindergarten.
Brilliant. I love it.
Well, Miss Natasha, I know that you are a co-author of an upcoming book. Can you share with our audience like what your contribution was to that book and when we can expect to see it out?
So, as you introduced me, the book is called Wealth Codes: Sacred Strategies for Abundance. It's divided into five parts: money, relationships, spirituality, freedom, and vitality. I'm writing under the freedom category, and my title of my chapter is The Beauty of the End Game: Finding Abundance Through Accepting Death.
Mm,
So, what you asked earlier was how can we get people to come to this point where, where we welcome it rather than fear it, right? The moment of death, that is.
mhm,
So that's the conversation that I've started in this chapter from my perspective. My choice is to make a lot of noise about it, to get people to like one person at a time, even if it's one person that I can impact, who
mhm,
can, when you were talking, I just had like a full aha moment, right? Like my whole body just went. "Ooh." So when you were talking about graduating from kindergarten, that
mhm,
bit, and I started this conversation by talking about the Mahamrityunjay mantra, right? And even though I've imbibed the whole thing and the concept, you gave me another dimension into that. So when I said that, when the time of death, let me disengage from the, may I be blessed with moving,
mhm,
disattaching from the vine as
mhm,
easily as a ripe cucumber, right? So
mhm,
it can be cucumber or any fruit, right? But basically, if I look at it now from the lens of what you said, that it's so interesting that this life, we grow and ripen, and then we naturally fall from the bough.
mhm,
And that was just like amazing. So it's not just about falling off from the bow, it's from being full and
mhm,
ready to graduate. And like, I love that, and thank you so much for like adding that to my to my perspective. I mean, I think this is really important. One is to accept the inevitability, and to be responsible, write our will, write our notes. This is the kind of stuff I
Mhm.
talk about in my chapter. So our book is, each chapter we talk from the authors, we share a story where I have spoken there about my mother's death, my experience of my mother's death. So you can read more about it then. And then there's the second part of the chapter, which is the strategy. That's where I talk about the
Mhm.
grieving process, and the accepting of the death. So this book is coming out on the 26th of August. It'll be available on Amazon, Kindle version, as well as paperback.
Well, thank you so much, Natasha, and we will definitely put the link to that in the show notes. I look forward to reading it, and particularly your contribution.
Thank you.
Can you share with us where our audience can find you?
So I'm on my company, I work under the umbrella called bodyspeak.in. My tagline is, your body is always speaking to you, all you have to do is listen.
Mm,
Because I believe the subconscious mind communicates with us through the soma. Um, but that's a conversation for another
definitely.
day. So it's bodyspeak.in. That's the website, bodyspeak.in. I'm on Instagram on the same handle, bodyspeak.in, and on Facebook as well. Only on Clubhouse, you'll find me as Natasha Sharma. Natasha.Sharma. Otherwise, yeah. So I look forward to communicating with anybody who reaches out to me. I love having these kind of conversations. It really like lights me up. So
Well, thank you so much, Natasha. It's been a wonderful conversation.
thank you so much, Susan. It's been a great pleasure and privilege to be here today. Thank you.
I want to thank you for taking this inner journey with us today. And whether you are coming or going, looking inside or out, remember to be conscious. If you love this episode and if today's message resonated with you, please subscribe, rate, and review the Be Conscious podcast. I want to know what inspired you and what conscious topics you would like to hear more about. And if you want, you can share those thoughts with me at info@susannicholas.org.
Thanks for listening to the Be Conscious podcast with author, TEDx international speaker, and conscious coach, Dr. Susan Nicholas. Be sure to connect with her to stay up to date with her latest news and works. Learn more about her conscious speaking platform at susannicholas.org/speaking. Stay tuned for the next thought-provoking episode. And whether you are coming or going, looking inside or out, remember to be conscious.